Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. On behalf of our college president, Dr. Eduardo Padron, I want to welcome you to Miami-Dade College, the Wolfson campus. We have a very special event for you this evening, but before we get started on that, I just want to remind you to turn off your cell phones so that we don't interrupt the conversation. And also, I want to remind you that Miami Book Fair is coming. We are in just the last couple of weeks before the book fair starts on November 12th, and it runs through November 19th. We have a lot of great events planned, and including our opening night community barbecue, and then a conversation with legendary journalist Dan Rather. There are book fair guides outside, and you can pick one up, and you can also make your own schedule by going online. We still have maybe another day to become a friend of the fair. So if you're not part of our group of members, please stop by the table outside, and we'll be happy to help you and give you all the information you need for the weeks ahead. So I'm going to get started with this very exciting event we have planned for you tonight. As you know, Commander Scott Kelly, someone who I know will inspire you the way that he's been inspiring me with the little, I've been able to read just a little bit of the book, and I'm already excited for book fair to be over so I could go on vacation and keep reading. But he does also have a children's book. So if you have little ones at home that are not ready for the full-on story, I think you can pick this one up. They're all autographed already, and they're outside waiting for you to take one home. I also want to tell you about our interviewer this evening. He's Dr. Jorge Perez Gallego. He's the curator of astronomy, and he is developer of exhibitions at the Philip and Patricia Frost Museum of Science, which is right across the street. So without holding up the proceedings much longer, I invite Dr. Perez Gallego and Commander Kelly to come up. And right before they do, we have a video to show you.
Throughout history, people have done things that are risky. Even though it is a risky thing to be doing, then I think it's a lot more risky than some people might think. So I still think it's worth it.
Astronaut Scott Kelly will try something no American has ever done before. This spring, he will leave for a mission and spend a year in space. His twin is former astronaut Mark Kelly.
Genetically, the brothers are almost identical, so scientists will be able to measure how Scott and Mark change physically and emotionally as months pass.
Warm up a little bit. This one's a bit of a Hail Mary. Here we go. Boom! Astronaut Scott Kelly at the International Space Station.
Scott Kelly has been working toward this mission his entire career. He's been working toward this mission his entire life in some respects.
I decided that the challenges staying in space for a whole year presented was appealing to me, even considering the sacrifices.
The human body was made for living in gravity. Strange things happen to us when we spend long periods of time without it. But that never deterred the former Navy test pilots from dreaming of becoming astronauts.
Pretty much anything we've ever put our mind to, we've been able to accomplish. Doing pretty good. I do feel like I've been up here for a really long time, and I look forward to getting home soon.
Interesting to watch. What a
Cool story.
great story and a fascinating experiment.
Space is still the most exciting thing I can imagine, and talking to someone in orbit still is, it's like I am an astronaut right now.
Are you concerned about the toll, the physical toll that this will take on you?
I do think about the effects of radiation. You know, the reason I'm here is to learn more about it, so someday we can travel further from low Earth orbit than we ever have before. A year is not short, but it was very rewarding. It was enjoyable. It was something that I feel privileged to having got to do.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guests, Commander Scott Kelly and Jorge Perez Castellon.
This is ready. Can you guys hear me? Thank you all very much. I'm probably as excited as you guys are. So, forgive me if I become like a fan with any of my questions. When I was asked to be here tonight to talk to Scott, I said, whoa, yeah. I wasn't even working. Last month, I've been on leave, so I wasn't technically working. But when they told me, can you do this? Of course I'm gonna do this. Something that I'm very fascinated about Scott's life and trajectory, and if you've read the book, you probably know a little bit about it, is that he got to space by pursuing the dreaming of flight. He wanted to be a pilot, and flight was his drive. I was lucky enough recently to work on an exhibition at Frost Science when I'm a curator and an exhibition developer, working on an exhibition about flight, and an exhibition that looks at flight from every single approach. I joke sometimes and say that if you were to ask a kid, a boy or a girl, what their favorite things in the science museums are, they are arguably dinosaurs, aircraft, and space. So those are the three things that we brought into that exhibition. So we talk about how dinosaurs evolved into birds, how birds were the ones that inform and inspire us to flight, and how eventually the sky here on Earth was no longer, was no longer a limit that we couldn't want to reach for more, and we wanted to explore space. And space exploration and flight itself, human flight, powered flight, is not that old, right? My grandma, who lived to 102 years old, is now deceased. She talked to me of knowing for the first time that humans were flying with power machines. And she told me also that during her lifetime that we made it to the moon. And she told me also that we were starting to build an international space station around the Earth. So she lived through all that. So the story of space exploration as it starts with flight, it's a recent one, and it's a story of pioneers. And Scott Kelly here is one of those pioneers because his work is going to allow us to go even farther. We're talking about going to Mars now, and that's something that we still need to learn a lot about the human body in order to achieve. But anyway, that's why I was really passionate about meeting Scott here, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to him in front of you tonight.
Well, thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen, and it's great to be here. Actually, after a year in space, it's great to be anywhere with gravity. On the space station, I changed positions so many times, you would have thought I was running for president. And to those of you in the audience that do not appear to be space aliens, I'd like to say good evening. And to the rest of you, I come in peace. So what we're going to do here tonight is, what I'd like to do is read a little bit from the book, maybe about 5 minutes, so you can hear the book in my voice without having to buy the audio book, since you just bought this book. And then we're going to discuss it for a little bit, and at the end, maybe with about 20 minutes left to go, we'll have time to answer your questions. And that's the part I enjoy the most, because you guys have generally really good questions. And feel free to ask me anything. It doesn't have to be about the book necessarily. If I can't answer it, I won't. I'm going to start in the prologue of the book. I'm sitting at the head of my dining room table at home in Houston, finishing dinner with my family, my longtime girlfriend, Amiko, who's right there in the front, my daughters, Samantha and Charlotte, my twin brother, Mark, his wife, Gabby, his daughter, Claudia, our father, Richie, and Amiko's son, Corbin. It's a simple thing, sitting at a table and eating a meal with those you love, and many people do it every day without giving it much thought. For me, it's something I've been dreaming of for almost a year. I contemplated what it would be like to eat this meal so many times. Now that I'm finally here, it doesn't seem entirely real. The faces of the people I love that I haven't seen for so long, the chatter of many people talking together, the clink of silverware, the swish of wine in a glass, these are all unfamiliar. Even the sensation of gravity holding me in my chair feels strange, and every time I put a glass or fork down on the table, there's a part of my mind that is looking for a dot of Velcro or a strip of duct tape to hold it in place. I've been back on Earth for 48 hours. I push back from the table and struggle to stand up, feeling like an old man getting out of a recliner. Stick a fork in me. I'm done, I announce. Everyone encourages me to go and get some rest, so I do. I'll fast forward ahead a little bit. So I go to our bedroom and lie down and go to sleep. Then something wakes me up. I feel like I have the flu, actually. And I say, I struggle to get up, find the edge of the bed, feet down, sit up, stand up. At every stage, I feel like I'm fighting through quicksand. When I'm finally vertical, the pain in my legs is awful, and on top of that pain, I feel something even more alarming. All the blood in my body is rushing to my legs, like the sensation of the blood rushing to your head when you do a handstand, but in reverse. I can feel the tissue in my legs swelling. I shuffle my way to the bathroom, moving my weight from one foot to the other with deliberate effort, left, right, left, right. I make it to the bathroom, flip on the light, and look down at my legs. They are swollen and alien stumps, not legs at all. Are there any kids in here? A few? Put your hands over your ears. Oh, shit. I say, Amiko, come look at this. She kneels down and squeezes one ankle, and it squishes like a water balloon. She looks up at me with worried eyes. I can't even feel your ankle bones, she says. My skin is burning too, I tell her. Amiko frantically examines me. I have a strange rash all over my back, the back of my legs, the back of my head and neck, everywhere I was in contact with the bed. I can feel her cool hands moving over my inflamed skin. It looks like an allergic rash, she says, like hives.
Wonderful.
There's 400 more pages.
So I was telling you while we were waiting how welcome I felt as a reader while I was reading the book, how welcome I felt to your journey all the way from when you were born to the 1 year in space. And I think, personally, I think that's because you mean every single word in there. And so my first question is, I guess, a question that I wonder about everyone that writes a book. When did you realize that that book was going to happen, and how that moment came to you?
So when I was in space for a year, and I was the first American to do this, I thought, this might be a good story for a book, and I thought people might appreciate it. So I started jotting things down and writing a journal about being in space, but also I started writing about, my life and how I got there. And when I was working on this, I realized, this is more than a story just about space, although it's built on the framework of being in space for a year. But the title actually speaks to a few other themes. Predominantly the fact that I was this kid that, had big dreams, but I was not a particularly good student. And to the kids in the room, I would say, do not use me as an example. I know it worked out well, but there were many opportunities to get off track and never wind up here talking to you today. Because I was one of those kids in school growing up that if I was in school today, I'd be the kid with ADD or ADHD. I spent actually all the time practically in the classroom looking out the window or looking at a clock, trying to will it to run faster so I can get out of there than I ever did paying attention in school. And I struggled my whole life, kindergarten through, I'd say 13th grade, my first year of college. and I was pretty much on the fast track to nowhere. I was in college, and I was doing the same things I did in high school. I couldn't pay attention, couldn't study. I didn't know how to study. I wasn't doing well. And one day I walk into the college bookstore to buy like gum or potato chips or something. Not a book. I don't think I'd ever probably bought a book before in my life. And then I saw this book on the shelf, and it had a red, white, and blue cover, and it had a really cool title. Made me pick it up. I started looking through it, was interested enough in what it had to say. I looked at the back. I took my gum money. I purchased the book. I went back to my dorm room, laid there for the next 3 days in my unmade dorm room bed, and read the stories about the fighter pilots that became the test pilots that became the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo astronauts. And the book was The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. And I could relate to these guys. There were things about them that were very relatable to me, the risk-taking, the, live with your hair on fire, although I can't do that now, but the live with your hair on fire attitude every day. And I felt like I was kind of like them, except for one thing. I wasn't a good student. And I thought, if I can fix that problem, maybe I could achieve what they achieved. So then I did the hardest thing I ever had to do, which was like teach myself how to study and pay attention. And I know what you're thinking, 18-year-old kid decides he's going to become an astronaut. That's a giant leap. Really what it was a bunch of very, very small, manageable steps that got me there. But if it wasn't for a book, The Right Stuff, I wouldn't be here sitting with you guys today talking about my book.
So I guess you're hoping your book may have a similar impact to the next generation. Did you like the movie, by the way?
I read the book many years before the movie came out, and the book had a lot of an impact on me. The movie, like most movies, the book is always better. Clearly you put a lot more information in there. So, yeah, I thought the movie was okay, but I think the book was much better, of course. Hopefully my movie's good.
Yeah, did you get the rights for the movie yet?
Yeah, actually Sony bought the rights to the book, so they're looking for a writer, like a screenwriter right now.
Who would like to play you?
Who would
who would you like to?
There's been several people mentioned. One was Jeremy Renner. People thought would be good. My favorite actor is Denzel Washington, so I think he should play me. He's a little old, but looked like 10 years older than me, but might work.
So, before we go to space, something else that really caught my attention is like how honest you were about where you came from and the family you came from and those kind of things that shape you, especially seeing your mother becoming a cop, all those things. I think I found it really valuable within the book to understand better your passion to overcome all the challenges.
A lot of people write, especially astronaut books, there's a lot of positive things in there. But it's true, there's a lot of positive things in these people's lives. I mean, after all, they got to fly in space. It's really a privilege. But I felt like, if you didn't put the bad stuff in there too, it makes the good stuff less believable. So I tried to include as much personal stuff as I was comfortable with. Actually, some even that I wasn't too comfortable with, but decided to keep it in there anyway. I actually wanted to talk about taking some of the stuff out, and I was talked out of it. But yeah, so I felt like being really honest and having personal stories and anecdotes that are not necessarily positive would make it a better book, and I hope that's the case.
So you committed to study, you became a great student, you went to college, and then you went to the Navy. What were you feeling during those times? Because were you feeling like, well, I've done great given where I came from. If it keeps happening, that's great. If this is where I get, that's great too. How did you negotiate that?
I had so many opportunities to just run off the rails that I think, that's why the title, I think, is so appropriate for this book, because as an example, the first thing is I'm not a good student. I have ADD or ADHD, whatever. I've never been diagnosed with this, but I'm pretty sure that's the case because it's very hard for me to pay attention, which, for an astronaut that has to learn how to fly pretty complicated spacecraft, that's kind of not a good, doesn't help. Clearly, I was able to overcome it. But when I got to Pensacola, Florida to learn how to fly airplanes, the first thing I realized when I get there is I am not a particularly good pilot. Now, I know that's hard to believe now, right? Because I was a test pilot. I flew the space shuttle as the pilot and commander. But at first, I wasn't really good at this at all. I think I eventually wound up flying the F-14 Tomcat, which is the airplane in the movie Top Gun. Yeah, famous for that movie, mostly. Also famous for killing a lot of people. Unfortunately, the people that flew the airplane, like myself on a number of occasions and my friends, and I wasn't very good at it. I think Tom Cruise would have been better at this than I was. I don't mean the guy in the movie. I mean Tom Cruise, the actor. He probably would have been a better pilot than me initially. I can remember the first time I went to take the F-14 to qualify on the ship, I landed so low that the hook of the airplane actually hit the back of the ship, the stern. I tell this story sometimes when my brother's around and he blurts out, he says, "That's crashing." Almost. It's almost crashing. But I had failed my very first time during the daytime qualifying on the ship, and daytime's supposed to be the easier part. Harder part is at night. And the first time I did, I failed during the day, and I was actually given an option of going to fly another airplane or going and trying to qualify again, knowing that if I failed the second time, I'd probably never get to fly anything. And I thought to myself, if I'm going to fail at something, might as well fail at something I think I might not be able to do, rather than something that might be easier, like flying a cargo airplane. No offense to any pilots that fly cargo airplanes. I mean, I didn't know if I could do that, actually, so I decided to give it another try. But there's all these cases, like, throughout my life of, having opportunities to fail, coming pretty close at times, but just sticking with it, enduring, even all the way through my spaceflight career, believe it or not.
Yeah, so then you keep pushing further, higher, faster, and eventually you become an astronaut, which was the dream.
Yeah, and actually before that I became a test pilot, like the guys in The Right Stuff. This was my life plan, and I was going to try to do like what they did, and eventually I figured out how to land on the ship and applied to test pilot school thinking I wasn't qualified. I hadn't been in the Navy that long, and somehow I got in. And I think, always, having the, just think of the right word. I wouldn't say it's bravery, but I would say more not being afraid to fail is a very, very important trait. I think a lot of people you hear, well, I'm not going to try to do that because I might fail at it. Who cares? I mean, unless it's something that might get you killed, right, or kill other people by accident. I think failure is an important thing for us to not be afraid of, and that's how people really realize what their capability is. And then when I got to become a test pilot, I was not really even thinking of applying to the space program for a long time because I didn't feel like I was qualified. I didn't have a master's degree, and most people either had a master's degree or a PhD or were medical doctors. And one day I'm working as a test pilot in Pax River in this little cubicle I shared with another guy, and he had this big stack of papers, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, that's my astronaut application. I thought, I said, when is it due? And he said, in like 2 days. So I filled out like 2 pages, and I figured I would just send it in and it'd be rejected, but at least I would know how to fill out the form for next time, like 10 years from now. So I sent it down there thinking I will never hear another word from them. And a few weeks later, my brother Mark, twin brother, who had a different path into the military than I did. When my dad was 8, or when we were, my dad was 8. My dad was 8. He was probably a troublemaker. But when we were in the 8th grade, my dad sat my brother and I down, and he said, "Okay, you know, you guys are not going to go to college because you are horrible students. Let's start looking at some vocational training." And that was enough to get my brother, like the next year, he got straight A's. And I had no recollection of this conversation. Like, I was probably looking out the window at the squirrel. So I didn't hear this, and I was actually confused for a while. I was like, how did my brother go from, like, crappy student like me to straight A student within a year? And it was because of this conversation. But so his path was different into the Navy. And one day, he's also working as a test pilot, and he says, NASA has agreed, or NASA called me for an interview. My brother says this. I was like, congratulations, that's awesome, good luck. Then my brother asked me if he could borrow my suit, because he didn't have a suit, and he knew I had been to a wedding, so I loaned him my suit. He goes down and interviews, comes back a week later, gives him my suit back. I, thought I would never hear anything, and then NASA calls me a few weeks later. They want me to come down for an interview. So I tell my brother, he thinks it's great, but then I tell him he's got to buy me a new suit. Because how ridiculous would that look? Us showing up in the same exact clothes, being identical twins. Because when we were 5 years old, my mother used to do that until we realized what she was doing, and we put a stop to it. It was actually kind of a blessing in disguise, however, because the way the interview works, you just walk into a room of like 20 very accomplished people, astronauts, NASA managers, and you tell your story. So I walk in the room, and the thing I say first is, I bet this looks really familiar to you. You've seen this suit before. So I have the only suit that's been picked to be an astronaut twice.
That's an interesting one. So then there's the whole training. Actually, like what's interesting to me also is that 100% of the Kelly twins made it to space, which is kind of amazing. I don't know how many siblings they both together made it to space. Are there other siblings?
No, there's
no.
none.
Yeah, it's just you guys. So I guess
just Mark and I.
So
there's a couple of cosmonauts that their dads were cosmonauts.
Okay. I mean, it always it's not something that we all do. So when you find that people that are related and made it, it's it's really impressive.
Clerical error.
So, how's your first time?
First time flying in space?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really hard. Flying in space is not easy, and training for flying in space is not easy, especially for a kid that couldn't do his homework and pay attention. When I became an astronaut, it was in 1996, and I flew my first flight in 1999, and that, 2.5, so that period of time, a little over 2.5 years from when we started, I spent almost all my free time studying, trying to learn how to fly the space shuttle. So it's the most, complicated aerospace vehicle ever built. 2,000 switches and circuit breakers, very complicated systems. Some of the switches, if you throw them at the wrong time or push a button at the wrong time, you can blow the thing up, and you and your crewmates along with you. And, fast forward from the day I read that book, I was 18. 18 years later, I was flying in space for the very first time, and I was the first American in my class of 35 people to fly in space. That's a pretty, I think back to it, and it's a pretty remarkable comeback from where I started, and doesn't even seem real, to be honest with you. But I, spent all this time preparing. Eventually, you get assigned. It's, I was probably more excited when I got assigned to my first space flight than I was when I became an astronaut, just because it seemed more real that I was actually going to have the opportunity, the privilege of flying in space. And I'll tell you what, leading up to it, you're thinking, this might be the last thing I ever do, because it's risky. We've had 2 accidents in in the shuttle program in 140 flights. So it's a 1 in 70 chance of getting killed, which is similar to what the soldiers had on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day during World War II. So it's risky, and you think about that leading up to it, but pretty soon you're in the silver Astro van heading out to the launch pad, and you get out there, and the launch pad is practically abandoned. There's a few people to help you get strapped in, but otherwise they don't want anyone nearby. Everyone's gets 5 miles away in case the thing blows up. And you get inside and you get strapped in, and they close the hatch, and clock starts counting down towards 0. Spending a lot of time getting all the systems ready for launch, the main engines, the orbiter maneuvering system engines, the reaction control system, attitude jets that the shuttle uses in orbit, the electrical system, the APUs that power the hydraulics, the environmental control system, the computers. All these things have to be perfect. Clock's counting down towards 0. Gets to 9 minutes and it stops. That's to give you time to catch up if you happen to be behind on getting this shuttle ready. It's also the time you think to yourself, man, this is a really stupid thing I'm doing. Flying into space for the first time, it's not something I ever thought I would actually say, although I wanted to be there. Then clock picks up again, and eventually gets to a minute, and then 30 seconds. At 30 seconds, the computers of the space shuttle take over the launch count. At 6 seconds, the 3 main engines light 1 million pounds of thrust, but you don't go anywhere because you're bolted to the launch pad by these 8 giant bolts, and the clock goes 5, 4, 3, 2, and this whole time the engines are pushing the shuttle like this, and then it kind of springs back this way because the engines are canted. And as soon as it gets right through vertical, the clock gets to 0, those bolts are exploded open, and the solid rocket motors are lit, and it feels like the hand of God has just picked you off the launch pad and is throwing you out into outer space. And if you've seen a space shuttle launch on TV or in person, it looks like it lifts off slowly. When you're inside, there is nothing slow about this. You get the feeling you're going somewhere. You're not sure where you're going, but you know you're not coming back to Florida. And when, after 8.5 minutes, those engines cut off and you're flying around the Earth at 17,500 miles an hour.
And once you're in space, I complain about my calendar, but your guys' lives are fully scheduled.
Very, very busy. The space shuttle flight is different than the space station flight. It's shorter, for one. It lasts 1 to 2 weeks. And, during that time, when you're in space and it's a short mission, you can train for everything you could possibly do, everything you're going to do, everything you might do. It's much different than living and working in space for months, or in my case, almost a year.
By the way, before I forget, as an astronomer and astrophysicist, thank you very much for fixing Hubble.
Yeah. My first shuttle mission was a Hubble Space Telescope repair mission. It's cool seeing that telescope in person because it's so big. It's the size of a school bus. Most of the pictures you see of it show like the side that doesn't point at the sun. Mm-hmm. It's not this. There's one side of it that's almost always like pointed at the sun, completely like burnt. You can see just how powerful the sun's rays are without Earth filtering them out.
I find interesting, like something that you mentioned in the book a couple of times, that you're not a scientist, but you struck me and some people that have read the book and we've talked about it, like as someone with a very scientific and critical thinking mind. And I think that's very helpful in this world of space exploration.
Yeah, so most of the science we do in space, and we will talk about that a little bit later, but most of the time we're the operators of the experiment. Occasionally, you'll be doing an experiment that requires you to make some scientific observation and collect some data that uses your power of observation. But most of the time, the people that perform, I think, the science better in space are the people that can follow the directions of the scientists, the real scientists on the ground.
Well, but also someone that can challenge some of their decisions, and I think. Anyway, so Something else that is interesting to me is like when you talk about the difference between the American and the Russian launches, and the difference in the procedures and the difference on like how they do things. Like in terms of security, you were saying like how the Americans had like everything clean around the launch pad. It seems that the Russians are a little bit more flexible about those rules.
Yeah, so they have to do a lot more with less, meaning like less money. They're very practical in a lot of ways, and you know I make some jokes occasionally about the Russians, but it's really in jest, and they've been great partners and great friends. But there are differences, and I think a lot of those differences are, you know, because of their cultural differences, their differences in from the economy, for the amount of money they have to spend, and a lot of times in space they just do things much more practically, probably more cheaply because they have no choice. But just comparing like the launch, particularly the launch and the landing, it's interesting. The shuttle and the Soyuz, and we don't fly the shuttle anymore. We had to retire it, but now we're launching on the Soyuz. They're similar in that they both launch people into space. And that's kind of where the similarity stops. You get out there in the Russian version of the Astrovan, you get out to the launch pad, but it is not abandoned, unlike on the space shuttle, because the Russians have different philosophies about things, and one is if your friend is going on a long trip, you are going to be there to say goodbye. It doesn't matter if it's at the base of this fully fueled rocket, liquid oxygen, liquid kerosene, all this vapor coming off of it. There's 100 people out there to say goodbye, and you could barely get through the crowd to get to your spaceship. Some of them are actually smoking cigarettes. And you're like, that guy is smoking there. And this thing, it could blow up, and you just want to get in as fast as possible because there's an escape system at the top. If it blows up, you could maybe... They actually had a rocket blow up, actually killed like over 100 people in the Soviet days. So different. You get in the Soyuz, and it's about as small as it can possibly be, and you can still fit 3 grown people in there. You're elbow to elbow, your knees are up to your chest, it gets hot inside. Visor's fogging up. There's no countdown clock. They didn't seem to have a need to put a countdown clock in there. This was going to be the rocket that launched nuclear weapons at the United States. And time passes, and eventually you hear some guy come up on the radio in Russian, and he says, ignition. And I'm pretty sure there was a guy running out there with a match who said that.
So during all the time of the space shuttle, you still saw yourself as a pilot, right? And once the space shuttle ended and you were launched from Russia, you had that moment of thinking like, well, is this something that I want to keep doing or not?
Yeah, in the astronaut office, we have mission specialists and pilots, and I was one of the pilots and the guy that was going to be the commander of the space shuttle, which I did. I did each of those jobs once, and I wanted to do that some more. But, sometimes in life, things don't work out like you expect. And for me, I kind of always had this rule that is, if someone asks me to do something and I don't really want to do it, I'll give them suggestions of like, hey, here's a better person to send to the space station because he's a scientist and I'm not. But in the end, I would always say okay. And that's somehow how I got kind of sidetracked into the space station business, which I'm very happy for, by the way, because it was just an incredibly rewarding experience to spend that amount of time in space.
Looks like a great project and an example that the only place in which we can all like get together and agree on something is outside of the Earth.
Absolutely. And then people often wonder about our relationships in space with, different countries. I was on this year-long mission. I flew with three American guys, an Italian woman, a Japanese guy, a British guy, a guy from Kazakhstan, a guy from Denmark, and a bunch of Russians. And we got along great. I mean, we never, even with the Russians, even though, historically we've been enemies and, we don't always get along well now. Who knows, maybe they were hacking into our election system on the space station, because I did vote up there. I wondered why I voted for Donald Trump. I didn't even think I did. Actually, that's a joke. I wasn't in space then. But during the election. But we get along great. Never do the, any kind of conflicts between our governments, become an issue because we have to rely on each other for, literally our lives. We support each other. We're friends. It was never a factor.
Do you think also the fact that you are seeing the Earth from outside that brings context to the greater good that you guys are working towards?
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at the world, you don't see political borders. You see generally a beautiful planet. Now, there's got some pollution issues that we need to deal with seriously, but in general, it's very beautiful without political borders. Mostly bad news coming from planet Earth. We follow the news a lot, but it does bring us, I think, together. Humanity together in space is affected by our view of planet Earth. Misha would often say to me, he would say, especially if it was something in the news about the United States and Russia, he'd say, Scott, if we want to solve our country's problems, all we need to do is send our presidents to space for a year together.
Actually, now that we're talking about looking back at Earth, one of your favorite views is actually close to Miami, right? In the Bahamas.
Oh, the view?
The
Yeah.
view, yeah.
Bahamas from space looks amazing. It's just so large and blue. It's hard to, it's impossible to mistake for anything else on Earth.
So let's talk a little bit about the 1 year in space thing before we go into the questions and answers. So the whole twin study was an afterthought, right?
Yeah, there's a study between Mark and I because we're identical twins, and NASA had almost a couple of decades of data on him to compare to me, since we're 99.9% genetically identical. If some of you are scientists, you'll know that a scientific experiment with one sample is not really good science with regards to the statistical significance of the experiment, but it is some interesting information and anecdotal data. But it was an afterthought after I was assigned that because I brought up a question about was NASA planning any research, like genetic research on us, NASA said no, but then they followed that up with, well, if we were, would you be interested? Because apparently, I didn't know this, apparently the government is not allowed to ask their employees to participate in genetic research. Not even allowed to ask. And because I had brought it up, that kind of opened the door. And they have found some interesting stuff.
So you are 1 year in space. I would ask you about Sidra. I would ask you about the bathroom. I would ask you about, but something that is really interesting to me is how you negotiate with Houston, because in a way they set the rules of the game, but you guys are playing the game and understand it better than anyone else. How do you guys negotiate that? Because there's a couple of conversations that point out how much input and how much you can actually inform for future missions. And
it's a partnership, and we're the folks at the tip of the spear, if you want to call it that are in the moment, that are present in space, and we have a different perspective from the folks on the ground, but there are thousands of people on the ground that support us. We always don't get along. The goal is for us to work together as good as we can, but it doesn't always work out that way. But I think the important thing is to always strive for teamwork and having kind of a common sense of mission and to do it together. But there's always times for conflict. But I think, how we deal with that conflict is really what defines us, not if you had conflict or not.
What's the hardest part of being in space for a year?
The hardest part is the people that you miss, your loved ones on Earth, and then the weather. Because the weather's always basically the same. The CO2 can get high, but besides that, same temperature, humidity, no wind on your back, no sun on your face, no rain, always the same every single day. Kind of like how it used to be in Southern California, I think. When people used to get, they get tired of the nice weather.
Well, let me tell you, we have spectacular weather here in Miami today and yesterday. No, it's not normal. I guess like you being so cool brought that cool front with you, and we're enjoying
Thank
it. So I guess like you went there, one of the main reasons is like to understand better how the human body is affected by space, with the idea, the ultimate goal of like reaching Mars within the next like 15, 20 years.
Yeah, so the idea behind Misha and I doing this on this space station that is an incredible research facility that we have now is to learn things that we need to learn to go to Mars someday. And when we're in space for long periods of time, bad stuff happens to us. We lose bone mass at 1% a month. So if you didn't, do any exercise or you didn't do anything to prevent that, we'd be all, after 100 months, you wouldn't have a skeleton left. We'd be all, sacks of like flesh and organs with no skeleton. It'd be like invertebrates. It'd be like Gumby.
I think about those guys from WALL-E.
From what?
The WALL-E, the movie.
WALL-E?
WALL-E, the movie. No. Oh, yeah.
Never familiar, never seen it. WALL-E?
Yeah.
I know what it is, but I'm not.
Anyway, so, but like, you think, let me ask you this, like, fast forward 15, 20 years, you are 15, 20 years younger, would you be one of the astronauts willing to go to Mars?
I'd be one of the astronauts willing to go to Mars 20 years older than I am now. One of the challenges is radiation on the way to Mars. When you're outside the magnetic field of the Earth, we get a lot more radiation in deep space. And our radiation limit, at NASA, we're considered radiation workers by OSHA standards, so we have limits. But the older you get, your limit gets much higher because you have less time to develop a fatal cancer from that radiation exposure. So, when they send people to Mars someday, it'd probably be old people. And actually, interestingly enough, we actually have a issue with our vision, that it seems like the pressure in our heads has affected our vision in a negative way. It's really been concerning for NASA, and we did a lot of research on that. But surprisingly, it only affects men. It doesn't affect women. So maybe the crew that goes to Mars will be a bunch of old women. The Golden Girls go to Mars.
The Golden Girls. they could turn it into a reality show really fast. So should we turn it over to...
Yeah. I think it'd be great to hear your questions. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, so one thing that came out several months ago now, that was that my telomeres, so our telomeres are things in our chromosomes that are an indication of our physical age. So as we age, the ends get shorter and more frayed. And they thought mine would get shorter and more frayed compared to my brother's, Mark, who was on Earth. And what they found was the exact opposite. Mine got better in space compared to his. Now, they don't think this is going to be like a fountain of youth, but it is pretty interesting when you have an experiment, your hypothesis is one thing, and the results are the exact opposite. And I was also reading a study today that just was published like this last week about gene expression between Mark and I. There's a chemical, anyway, I can't think of it, but my genes were turning on and off at a much higher rate when I was in space and right after I got back. Now, I'm not even sure what that means, but it was something that was very surprising to them, and they are going to look into this much more, into it much further with other experiments, because, when these genes are turning on and off, that exposes you to certain illnesses and diseases, or maybe protects you from them, and they were really surprised to find that. Nemnoshka. But, so yeah, we learn English. Well, we learn English. I learned English at a young age. I'm still working on it, apparently. And I've took Russian for almost 20 years, and it's was a really big challenge for me. The language on the space station is English, so most of the time we speak English because of that reason. Also, we speak it because the Russians generally speak English better than we speak Russian. And I think that there's a number of things. One is they're exposed to it culturally, where we really aren't. In school, half of them take English, the other half take German as a foreign language. And then they have more of a reason to learn it. For me, Russian is valuable in Russia and in the Russian Soyuz, which is where we generally would speak Russian. But English is valuable as a language if you're going to travel outside of your country. So they had seemed like a motivation outside of just their job to learn how to speak English. Hello. We're going to get you a microphone.
Hello?
Yep, works.
Hello.
Hello.
I know you missed your family in space, so what do you miss now from space?
You know, one of my my cosmonaut colleagues, Gennady Padalka, that I talk about in the book, he says, when we're in space, we miss Earth, and when we're on Earth, we miss space. More specifically, though, to answer your question, what I miss about space, two things. I miss the work and how it was so technically exacting and you had to be very precise, and if you mess things up, it could be really bad. Now, if I mess things up, I tell a bad joke, I tell you something that's wrong, really not many repercussions, but in space, it's very, very serious. And then I miss the people I was there with. You know, we spend a lot of time together, we become great friends, and then we don't see each other much anymore. So I think the human connection is both as a earthling and a astronaut in space is very, very important to us. How about this guy right here who's wearing that cool suit? You going to use that tomorrow, too? What's your question?
This is odd. Not the place, because this space shuttle go to the space station and the engines turn on. I think I saw the space shuttle Atlantis. That's the only time, and I saw the space shuttle Atlantis standing there with the open door.
Mm-hmm.
The space shuttle door is open to the. It's like this.
Okay.
The wings is like that, turning back.
Is that your dad there sitting next to you?
Yeah, that's my
Can
dad.
he translate your question for me? Like I said,
No
my
way.
English is not that great.
What's your question, son?
What was his question? Which one? VF-143, the world-famous Pukin Dogs. That was our name. And I flew the F-14B mostly, but I also flew the D. I also flew the F-18 some. But the Tomcat's much better. It's like the Harley-Davidson of fighter airplanes.
Sir.
Yeah, you can go like that, or like that, or like that. But you don't want to do that for too long. Do that for too long, it's not going to be good. Yeah, we watch movies and TV. I like watched Game of Thrones twice in space. I actually saved it for years because people were telling me how good this was, and I figured, you know, I was never bored in space, but it's good to have some kind of like entertainment like that. So, also watched Gravity, the movie Gravity, which is kind of like watching a movie of your house burning down while you're inside of it.
Sir, At a personal level, what did you learn about yourself in terms of, don't know, tolerance or organization, or how was the personal development?
You know, in the book, in the back, I have a lot of the things I learned while I was in space. It's almost like a list. And, you know, one thing I learned about myself in the course of my 20-year career at NASA is, for some reason, I could, you know, I don't know why it's the case, but deal with stuff that is, you know, risky and technically complex. And it seems like the more the risk, the more the ability I had to pay attention to it. And I think in some ways, like, ADD can be an advantage here. I would often find, you know, some of my colleagues that were very, very, you know, overachievers and, you know, the straight A student their whole life, and they would have trouble like letting things go, and you can't pay attention 100% of the time, all the time, for months and months. You have to be able to prioritize and focus on the stuff that's really important and ignore the stuff that isn't important. And I found that I was really good at that, and other people were not. And I was surprised. Not everyone, but there were people that, you know, just had a hard time, you know, not doing everything perfectly. And you wouldn't think that would be the case in space. You would think you would have to do everything perfectly, but that's an impossible thing to keep up with. But there's also a lot of other things. I mean, I learned that after spending 520 days in space, I became more of an empathetic person for, you know, our planet, the atmosphere, but also the people on Earth, and, you know, just the, you know, human condition, just, you know, feeling more connected to it, and, you know, wanting, you know, more for our planet and our civilization to work better to solve our common problems. How about over here, right in the back? Yeah. Wow, okay. So you said something about eating something for breakfast? Did they eat the same breakfast? Oh, steak and eggs. Ah, that's a good question. You know, I didn't really talk about that in here. But yeah, during the early days of the space program, astronauts, I don't know why they did this, but they would always have steak and eggs before they launched. I never did that. Although in Baikonur, I had eggs and hot dogs. They called them sausages, but they were really just hot dogs. What was the second part of your question? Yeah, so I started off 6 minutes younger than my brother. He was born 6 minutes before me. And because of Einstein's general relativity, the faster you go compared to a reference frame that's not going as fast, time slows down for you. Interestingly enough, Einstein referred to this as the twin paradox. Yeah. Twin on Earth, twin flying in space. Guy goes like close to the speed of light for a number of years. He comes back and his brother on Earth is years older than him. Well, in my case, because I traveled for 500 days at very high speed compared to my brother, where I used to be 6 minutes younger than him, I am now 6 minutes and 13 milliseconds younger than him, which he always likes to point out that he's now even older than I was. You know, because I was in space for so long, though, people felt like even though I was getting younger, this environment, zero-G radiation, harsh environment, as we aged, I would actually physically look older. So like when we got to be 60, I might look like I'm 75 and he's looking, you know, a spry 60 years old. Well, I think if that happens, what really happened is my brother Mark got Botox. Seems like it's something he would do. Yes, sir, right here.
lately we've had some near misses. So did you get to study any of those asteroids and comets as they traveled by Earth? And are they a serious danger?
There's a lot of space junk out there. And there's also a lot of space, which is good. The space station gets hit all the time. Fortunately, none of those strikes have ever penetrated the pressurized volume. But when I went out and did 3 spacewalks, there's a lot of little holes all over the place. Some were like bullet holes on the handrails. I mean, something clearly hit that handrail going really fast. And there's I have a story in the book about us having to avoid a satellite. Well, actually, we didn't avoid it. We didn't see it early enough to avoid it, so we had to basically prepare for impact. And that's something that's been done 4 times in the basically 20 years at the space station, almost 20 years that the space station has been flying. So yeah, we did have cases of that, but I think you might also be referring to that deep space. I guess it was would you consider that, a comet or a meteor? I guess we don't even know. Yeah, there's something that came like out from a weird direction in space where you wouldn't normally.
It's probably the first object that is visiting from outside the solar system inside. So it's the first one. So it's the first time we have a chance to really study those objects and learn more about potential others that might visit in the future.
Because a lot of those meteors and comets that are in space, they're all on the same plane, right, as our solar system. And they, pass by Earth or the sun, or they pass by a lot of things, and they're in an orbit and come back around, all in the same plane that all the planets are in. Recently, we had something come like straight down, right? If you consider north up, but it came like 90 degrees out of plane, which is, really surprising.
That's the thing. Once you're outside, where's north and south on Earth?
Yeah.
So we have time for 2 more questions? Okay. Who's it going to be?
How about this man right in front?
Hi. You mentioned pollution before, and I was wondering if over the course of seeing the Earth from space since 1999, can you see the visual effects of climate change on the planet?
Yeah, so you can definitely see the visual effects of pollution, without a doubt. There's clearly more pollution now than there was when I first flew in 1999. At least it seemed that way to me. Now, granted, when I flew in 1999, I was in space for a week. And my last flight, I was in space for almost a year. But there is a lot of pollution over certain parts of China, eastern China, almost always covered with pollution. India, the Indian subcontinent. And interestingly enough, we're like the 2nd biggest polluters in the world. It's just the United States. It's just like our pollution is not the type that you can see easily. It's not from coal, it's not from as much from, smoky cars. There was actually one day I saw all the cities in China lit up and clear, like there was no pollution, and I was shocked because I had always seen that area just kind of covered in a blanket of fog. And the next day I saw on the news that there was a holiday. The Chinese government turned off a lot of the power plants and sky cleared right up. You can see the rainforests, the devastation in the rainforest, that's noticeable. And the other thing I've noticed is just seeing storms in like weird places where you wouldn't think to see like a hurricane, like off the coast of Oman. Definitely see fires in the western part of the United States. But to say, I'm a big believer in climate change. I think it's not because I'm a scientist, it's just because I know I'm not a scientist, so I know to trust the 97% of scientists. And I find it shocking how people with no scientific background will just say, oh, I don't believe that. You trust the experts. So do you see climate change from space? I guess maybe you could say a little bit, but more what you see is the pollution and deforestation, absolutely. How about person right there? Last question.
What do you think about, what do you, what advice would you give to somebody that wants to be an astronaut?
Very good question. So if you're talking about a NASA astronaut, and that's my expertise, what I would say is NASA has a certain requirements that are the minimum requirements. And basically what those are is a bachelor's degree in a qualifying field, and those are science, math, engineering. I was an engineering major eventually, medicine. They like people, some people in the military. You don't have to be in the military to be an astronaut, but they're pilots. But then you have to be in one of those fields, but then I would say choose the one you like. Don't say, well, I'm going to be a pilot because I saw Scott Kelly up here and he was a pilot. If you want to be a chemist, you know, become a chemist, because NASA wants people that have done well in their jobs, and if it's something you like, you're going to do better in it. But then, you know, not only do you need to do well in your job, you have to be good at other things. You can't, NASA would never, I was on the selection board, we would never select like the best physicist in the world unless that physicist could do other things, because on the space station, you know, not only are you the scientist, you're the engineer, you're the mechanic, you're the plumber, the electrician, the doctor, the dentist. You got to do all those other things and then demonstrate that you can work well as part of a team. Maybe demonstrate that you can live in, you know, kind of rough conditions. Those things are what I think make, you know, the perfect candidate. So, but the most important thing is choose something you like. Of course, something that's qualifying. And then understand that I am like the most unlikely person to be sitting up here and telling this story. So, you know, if it's possible for me to do this, it's possible for you to do it too. Well, that's great. Last question. And I'd like to just follow up with one thought that I have just to kind of tie everything together, and that is, I spent 500 days of my life on the space station. This is a space station, a facility that I became intimately familiar with and learned to really appreciate. And as I was leaving for the last time, and I'm looking out at it, and I'm thinking, I'm never going to see this place again. And then I'm thinking, like, what went into building it, and the dedication that went into building it. And the fact that we built this million-pound structure the size of a football field while flying around the Earth at 25 times the speed of sound, in extremes of temperatures of plus and minus 270 degrees in a vacuum. We built this thing and connected these modules together, some of which have never touched each other before on Earth. We did this with this international partnership of 15 different countries, different languages, different engineering standards, different cultures. Now, this is the hardest thing we have ever done. And if we can do this, we can do anything. I mean, if we want to go to Mars, we can go to Mars. If we decide we want to cure cancer and we put the resources behind it, we can do that. If we want to fix our problems with the environment, we can do that. Challenges in your life, after spending a year in space, I was absolutely inspired that if we can dream it, we can do it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott Kelly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here tonight.